Okay, so welcome to my talk, 30 Black Characters, Reflections on Representation and Bias in Games and Other Media. I'm Kayode. Most people would call me Kay, and I'm half Welsh, half Nigerian. This talk is going to be about race, so for the purposes of this talk, I'm also half white and half black. I'm from London. I'm a game designer and lecturer currently living in Sweden, and I love animation and games. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I've done in terms of game development, I worked on a game called Affordable Space Adventures, and more recently I worked on What the Golf. I'm going to be talking initially about bias and representation and what I mean by bias and representation in this context. Give you a little bit of personal and global context to the project that I worked on, which was called the 30 Black Character Project. I'll explain a bit about So just to give a bit of a disclaimer, what I won't be talking about what I won't be doing is giving a framework. This isn't going to be a talk about how to make good. It's more going to be kind of just talking about how to think about bias and representation in general. I don't speak for all Black people. I'm one person who has one particular context and particular experience, and so I'm just talking from that. I'm still learning, and hopefully all of us will agree that we're all still learning. And this topic is complex, and I had to cut down this talk quite a lot because there's not so much time. So saying that, let's move on. So when I say bias, I'm specifically meaning a tendency to favor or disfavor specific ideas, objects, groups, etc., based on our current understanding of the world. So there's a lot of things that we could mean by bias, but just to kind of break it down into two categories, we have explicit bias, which is in this image you can see that the people who put up that sign, "We want white tenants in our white community," know exactly what they want. They want segregation, and so this, I think, is sort of the recognizable racism. This is when people saying slurs and sort of hate crimes, things like that. And then there's implicit bias or unconscious bias, and that's more, I think, if you think of situations where somebody's been called out for something being racist and they have the response, "I'm not racist," that's likely because they were acting in implicit bias. So here in this image, you can see that the police are searching a Black man, and black people are disproportionately searched by police than white people. And this is probably not because police are explicitly thinking, "I hate Black people," but there's just an implicit bias that they're more likely to search Black people than white people. Okay, so moving on to representation. What I mean by representation is a depiction or portrayal of a person or group of people. That's pretty simple and pretty broad in that sense. There's a couple of types of representation that I want to talk about. I don't know if these are established terms or if there are established terms for these concepts, but this is just something that I've come up with kind of reflecting on the project that I did. The first is accumulative representation. And that would be every time we see an example of an individual from a group, our conceptual model of the possibilities of that group expands. So we update our bias about that group of people. So if we look at Simpsons, and for the sake of argument, in The Simpsons, if a character is yellow, they are white. We're not talking about sort of in terms of the color white here, but that's in terms of the racial category white. When we watch The Simpsons, we know that the yellow characters are supposed to be white. So if we look at this image of the Simpsons characters, there's a lot of characters in the Simpsons, and that's why I chose the Simpsons to look at in particular. And here you can see there's a lot of different ways of being a white person in the Simpsons. So as someone who's watching The Simpsons, and this of course expands sort of more broadly to media in general, you get a lot of examples of sort of what it can be like to be a white person, and your bias about white people will continuously being updated accumulatively, and so generally you kind of have there's a lot of possibilities of what it can be like to be a white person. On the flip side of the coin, there's also infrequent representation, and so this is often minority characters are disproportionately have few examples. So infrequent representation is when there's only a few examples, and so those few examples hold a disproportionate responsibility for representing the whole group. So if we go back to The Simpsons, and a famous example of this, because of Hari Kondabolu's documentary, The Problem with Apu. If we take a look at Apu, his character is one of the few examples of Indian Americans on television, and essentially in The Simpsons, it's just Apu and his family. And so this quote from the documentary, every country in South Asia is different, but when you grow up in the US, it doesn't matter because you're still going to be called Apu. And I think this is coming from, because there is such infrequent representation of Indian Americans, or any South Asian Americans in general, you generally get compared to Apu, whereas if you were going to be compared to a white character in The Simpsons, if you're a white person, you're most likely going to be compared based on your personality, not just based on the nationality. So this talk isn't about The Simpsons, so let's move on. I'm just going to go back to my definition of bias, based on, and hone in on the sort of last part of that, based on our current understanding of the world. The reason I want to kind of highlight that part of the sentence is that our understanding of our biases are not necessarily fixed. And so they're developed from things that we've experienced and witnessed in our own life, so sort of first-hand experience, things that we've been told. So this might be sort of generally by people that we know. And similarly to things that we've been told, this is essentially being told things, but through media, things that we see, hear, read, and play. And those second-hand experiences, we have to kind of rely on other accounts, and we tend to also kind of filter that through the things that we've experienced in our own lives. So essentially what's happening is we see some representation that leads to our bias, and then as creators, if we're creating new characters, our bias then leads back to the type of representation that we create. Give an example from my own life, going back to some embarrassing images from when I was 16 that I drew. I was working on a comic book with a friend who's another mixed race, Black British person, and we were creating a superhero comic that we never finished. But all of the main characters, all of the heroes were white. The only Black character that we created in the comic book was a villain who was also based on stereotypes of gangsters, or if you're from London, roadman. And this wasn't something that we questioned. This was just based on things that we knew from media that we've consumed. We had 3 male heroes, 1 female hero. That ratio was just something that we'd kind of noticed in other things, and even the idea that we were doing this because we'd noticed it wasn't something that we were reflecting on. I want to bring this up because I think it's important to realize that people of color are also in the same system, and we're also experiencing the same, or we're getting the same bias from the same messages that we're getting from media. And I think, yeah, sort of my Black identity was something that growing up I really struggled with. and I'd really internalized that sort of white was default, and I was something other than that. So if we get back to recent times, on May 25th this year, 2020, George Floyd, an unarmed Black man, was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis for trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill. Unfortunately, this isn't something that is particularly unusual. This is something that happens a lot in America, and actually also happens a lot outside of America. But what was unusual was the response. So protests started happening in Minneapolis. They also started in New York and Washington, D.C., and it wasn't restricted to America. Protests happened in London, happened in Vienna, in Copenhagen, Berlin, even all the way in Japan, in Osaka. And essentially protests were happening all over the world. And this was really notable to me because I kind of felt that, I don't know, sort of Black issues and sort of difficulties that minorities and people of color face, it seems like such a struggle to get people who don't face those difficulties and don't have to deal with prejudice and sort of bias in everyday society. It's really difficult to get their attention and to get them noticing. And it seemed like huge amounts of people and huge amounts of white people were in support of this. But at the time I was stuck on Gotland, which is a small island in Sweden where I live. I was in my apartment scrolling through Twitter, and for a few days I was finding it very difficult to know kind of what to think or how to contribute. On the 1st of June, the only thing I could really express was just fuck, and I was feeling emotional and helpless, and there weren't any local protests. I did notice that there was a drawing while Black hashtag that was trending on Twitter, and lots of Black creators and Black artists were sharing the work that they were producing, and so it was the beginning of the month, and I had the idea to sort of join the protest in my own way by going back and looking at characters from media that I enjoyed throughout my life, sort of finding Black characters and creating images of them joining in the protest. So, sorry. So I mostly took characters from cartoons and games, but I also took a few fictional characters from live action things as well. Here's an image of Finn from Star Wars. I thought it was important to include that because John Boyega, the actor who portrays Finn, was very active in the London protests. And I gave myself some restrictions. Also, I wanted to write a reflection on sort of that particular character's relation to Blackness and kind of how fans may have responded to them, or how they've been portrayed, things like that. And I've restricted that to the length of a tweet. So these are the 30 Black characters that I came up with. And it's kind of interesting sort of looking at this in comparison to the image from The Simpsons with all of the characters together. And it was actually quite difficult for me to find examples of Black characters, especially from games. There were a lot of games that I would have liked to include, but when I looked at them, I realized there were no Black characters in there at all. It meant that I sort of had to do a little bit of a deep dive. I ended up going back into my childhood and taking characters from Tom and Jerry and Dumbo and things that I actually probably wouldn't have thought of initially, but were quite interesting to kind of see how Black characters had been depicted sort of throughout my life and what my relationship to that was. So Black coded characters, characters that you could argue aren't, are because they're not human, they're not necessarily Black, but I think they have enough traits that they can be identified as Black characters, that I decided to include them. Another sort of subset of Black coded characters are characters that sort of rely on racist stereotypes. These were generally characters that I noticed from older forms of media. So here you can see Mammy Two Shoes from Tom and Jerry, Mr. Popo from Dragon Ball Z, and Jim Crow from Dumbo. And here you can see the tropes that they've used to kind of build these characters. So in the case of Mammy Two Shoes and Jim Crow, their names are based on the racist tropes. So the Mammy trope and Jim Crow, who was a minstrel character and then was subsequently the segregation laws in America. Interestingly, Jim Crow laws were still in effect when Dumbo was created. And then Mr. Popo takes inspiration from minstrels and gollywog dolls. Another subset of Black characters is sort of the concept of tokens. Token Black from South Park is named after this concept and is kind of a parody of it. But they're generally side characters that are included with minimal effort and a nod towards diversity. So, and I think this is also one of the side effects of the infrequent representation, that kind of it becomes very clear that so the character stands out not because of their characterization or that they're not necessarily a developed character, but they stand out simply because of their race and being sort of apart from the rest of the cast of the show. This is also something that sort of as a Black person in the games industry, you often sort of end up in a situation where you're the only Black person in the room. And so it feels a little bit like being a token in the industry. Getting into games, like I say, it was actually quite difficult finding Black characters from games, and surprisingly, I thought it would be easier in indie games, but it was actually even more difficult than I expected. And here is actually a study that was, these graphs are from a study that sort of show the amount of representation of different races, and you can kind of see even and this is specifically in indie games, and even though you would think that indie games they allow sort of a more diverse array of creators to create things, there's still an overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly dominant representation of white characters. So one thing that you could think, so those are characters that have been sort of specifically built and their stories have been written. But one thing that games allows us to do is create our own characters. And in the recently released Animal Crossing New Horizons, you were finally allowed to sort of create a Black character with Black hairstyles and dark skin tone. In previous games, there was quite a few convoluted ways that you had to do that if you wanted to be a Black character. Here you can see one of the things that you often have to deal with kind of being on the internet as a person of color is someone saying, it's a fun game and I'm glad you can make characters that look like yourself, but I hate this type of baiting on social political issues. And the idea that just being able to kind of create your own skin tone in a game that's about kind of creating a digital version of yourself, the idea that that's political is pretty frustrating, to be honest, but you see it often, that reaction. Here's a sort of rundown of what you had to do in previous Animal Crossing games. So initially, the only way that you could get a Black character was to get a tan, which you could only do during the daytime in summer months. And it would take 5 days if you wanted to get the darkest skin tone, and it was only temporary. After that, they did add a patch to the game where you could have a Black me mask, but initially when they added that, your arms were still white. So it was a little bit of a kind of you can kind of see the bias of the developers here, where they're really not thinking about the actual use case of this and what the players want and why they would want to create a black character. So there's, you can also see kind of that similar, it's less convoluted, but it's essentially giving a white character a tan in the character selection here. This is something that's like very common. It is essentially just darker skin on the white character, but not taking into account the difference in hair or facial features. And here you can see that they didn't even necessarily think about changing the color of the mother in Pokemon Sun and Moon, which was ironically, as I'm biracial and my mother is actually white. You actually they accidentally gave me representation, but in the more recent games, you can see that the mother's color updates with when you change the character. It's not just in Japanese games. In Western games, this issue of kind of not being able to create a black character even in character customizations exists. So in World of Warcraft, they recently announced that in the update, they were going to allow you to finally create different races for the humans. This update still isn't out yet, and the game's been out for a decade and a half. Fans have kind of taken this into their own. Fans have sort of taken it into their own hands, and in the Sims community, there's black Simmers who mod the game to add more skin tones and hairstyles, and yeah. So just quickly, I know I don't have much time, but sort of if we're thinking about kind of why this is important to think about as creators, I think it's one of the things as game designers we try to do is really think about what the users or what the players are going to be doing and how to kind of best design experiences to cater for them. And there is a sense of kind of putting yourself in other people's shoes. And I think examining our own biases and sort of questioning those is a really important part of the game design toolkit. And I think the first step of that is to accept that we have bias in the first place, question the biases that we have, learn about sort of different tropes and existing cultural biases, and sort of continuously work on that. And I think, and of course, I've specifically been talking about Black representation here, but this goes across the board for people of color in general, or people with disabilities, and LGBTQ representation. And we all have biases about people in other groups, but also about our own groups. And I think generally it's a good practice to question those. So sorry, I think I don't have time for questions, but if you want to look at the more specific text of the characters, then you can check out my website or my Twitter, which are both Kayode Design, just Kayode Design. Thank you.